Johnson Chukwu, CEO of Cowry Asset Management Limited, joins us now to discuss this fresh development in the petroleum sector as it affects the Nigerian economy. Welcome to Newsday, Johnson Chukwu.
Thank you for having me. Good day.
Yes, thank you very much for coming on the program. So let's quickly start with the finance minister herself, Zainab Ahmed. She, from what we've heard, the timing was, according to her, is problematic, and rising inflation as well, taking that into consideration. As an economist, what are your thoughts?
Well, my thought is that when she made reference to the timing, and she said the timing was inappropriate, I agree with timing that the timing is not appropriate. Not principally because of high inflation rate, principally because it's a pre-election year. And I knew, right from the point that the federal government said they're going to take out the subsidy, that it was going to be almost an impossibility to take out subsidy in a year that preceding the election year. National elections are going to hold on February to 18th. And you are talking of taking out subsidy in July. Just barely 8 months to a national election. There's no political party in the world that would take such impactful economic decision given the negative implications as it relates to the populace. And you already know that there is a lot of agitation by Labour not to take out the subsidy. So I knew if they wanted to do it, they should have done it earlier. And I had also said that by the time they signed the Petroleum Industry Act, I expected some level of price modulation. You should have allowed the consumers to begin to adjust to the increase in price. So they should have allowed prices to trend upwards instead of fixing the price at 162, 165 and hoping that on July 1st, you just have one first swoop, big bang approach, move from 164, 162 to 165 to maybe 400 naira. There was no economy that would have accepted that. So I knew that in terms of timing, the timing was not appropriate as it relates to the political sensitivity of taking out subsidy, not in relation to the inflation rate.
Okay, all right. So before we ask our next question, we'll go on a quick break. When we return, I will continue our conversation with Johnson Chukwu, who is the CEO of Cowry Asset Management. Stay with us. Welcome back to Newsday. Just before the break, we had a guest, and we still do have that guest, who is Johnson Chukwu, CEO of Cowry Asset Management, who is joining us to discuss Nigeria's government as they discuss on the suspension of fuel subsidy removal. So let me throw to my other anchors now to ask you our next question.
Well, the issue of fuel subsidy, it's been a lingering issue, and most people agree that, subsidy has to be removed. It's just, it seems that the government is a bit confused on how to go about removing it. So in your own opinion, how should the federal government go about removing petroleum subsidy?
What I would say is that, as it relates to how they will go about removing subsidy, it's something that, like you rightly said, we've been dealing with it and we've been contending with it. The first thing you need to do is that you have to ask yourself, who are the beneficiaries of the subsidy? So who are those that were impacted most when the subsidy removed? Certainly not the person who is a farmer in the rural village. If you look at the population demography of the country, more than 50% of Nigerians live in the rural areas. So they are not the ones that were most affected. I know people in my village who don't even go to the next town in a year. So they know their number. The people who will be most affected are those who have vehicles. And those who have multiple vehicles, particularly those that have fuel-consuming vehicles. So they're the ones who are benefiting, and unfortunately, they're the ones who are the decision makers. So if you really want to look at the people who ride public transport, they're the people who are benefiting use most to complain about it taking out the subsidy. So you need to address the concerns they have. So in other countries in the world, they have social safety nets. We can develop a social safety net today. We can no longer say we don't have information on the Nigerian population. We can't say we don't have information on the most vulnerable in the society. And what other countries do is that you give them possibly some support, like in Brazil where they introduce the conditional cash transfer. And for those ones, so you help them cushion the increase in cost of transportation because they're the ones who will feel it most, or they're the ones who are most vulnerable to any change in average prices. Then those who are in positions to afford it, you take out the subsidy completely. You and I don't need subsidy to drive to the office. But the man who takes a bus from Oshodi to come to VI may need subsidy. But the subsidy must not necessarily be paid on petrol. It can be paid into his account. And then he can decide how he wants to do that. If we are waiting until you have public transport in the country, you're not going to achieve that because it take a lot of investment before you have the efficient public transport system in the country. And unfortunately, what we're dealing today is an existential problem because the economy of this country cannot survive subsidy for too long. If you look at the fiscal framework of the country, you realize that we are spending more than 80% of our current revenue on servicing debt. And not only that, you are still borrowing more. If you add your recurrent expenditure to your debt service, you realize that in no year for the past 6 years have we been able to earn enough revenue to cover our recurrent expenditure. So we're digging a bigger hole. And unfortunately for us, our reserve is now suffering what you may call double whammy, in the sense that all the major sources of inflow into the reserve have declined. Your crude production has declined. Last year, you produced an average of 1.31 million barrels a day. And you are still importing refined petroleum products, even as prices are going up. So what you are seeing now is that we are getting to a point where even the export of crude will not earn enough foreign exchange for the importation of refined petroleum products. And what you are importing is servicing not just Nigeria, every other country in Africa, in West Africa. You are talking of 60 million liters consumption a day. Could that naturally be our consumption, or is we are financing the consumption in Cameroon, in Togo, in Benin Republic, and other neighboring countries? So the reality is that what we need to do is address the most vulnerable, come up with conditional cash transfer that will support the most vulnerable in the society, and take out the subsidy and let those who can afford to drive around. But we cannot pretend that we are supporting the most vulnerable. Like I said, if you look at the demographic of the country, more than 50% live in the rural areas. I use my village as an example. There was a time when the road in my village was paved, and they paved out a particular part of the village. And I went home 6 months after, and I asked people in my own village where the road has not been paved out to. And they said they had not been to that site. And I wondered, you live in that distance is about 5 kilometers. They had no business leaving their house at the village square. And that's what applies to most people in the rural areas. They don't have anything to do with fuel subsidy. The people in the urban areas who are not earning enough to buy cars are the ones who suffer most because of changes in price level. So we can cushion the impact on them by giving them conditional cash transfer and save the economy from starting collapse if we continue under the current fiscal framework.
And speaking of certain collapse, the federal government has said that they've provided till July for till June for these subsidies. And the average person, the NLCs, the CSOs, they're going to go on strike. They're still planning to go on strike starting Thursday. How do you explain to them the importance of removing the subsidies? How do you marry that in between the hardships that they're facing and the fact that the country is imminently going broke and something has to be done?
Well, what I would say is the Labour Congress officials absolutely understand the economics of subsidy. They are playing to the gallery. And I think they are not being fair to the society. What they should be pushing is, how do we cushion the impact of market-reflective cost of fuel on workers? And they should also look at the bigger picture. Today, we don't have employment in the midstream, downstream oil and gas sector as it relates to refining. That's where we would have created more employment. We're talking of 33.3% unemployment in the country. Labor unions should be pushing, how do we increase the employment? You can't increase employment if you have the current fiscal framework structure. So they are not, for me, as far as I'm concerned, they know the economics of it. And they could have actually asked for what will the long run serve the country. What we have to realize, which I say the inappropriate of the time, is because of political exigencies. Labour say they still go on their one strike and they will sit and wait for the government. The simple reason that a pre-election year is the best time for any agitator to extract the greatest value from any government. Labour Union, I made a presentation to some people on last Friday, and I said to them that you should prepare to watch government-labor relationship this year. Every agency that needs to extract a pound of flesh from the government will do that, because the government is most vulnerable in a pre-election year, because they want to please everybody. So they are not going to focus on what are the core economic issues. They're going to focus on what are those political decisions we have to take that will make people happy. In an election year, in a pre-election, you're going to see executives of government coming to dance in the market square to entertain. They turn to jesters just to make people happy so they win votes. And given that tendency, I knew it was going to be a tough call for the government to take out the subsidy. And unfortunately for them, this is the time for Labour to extract as much as they can from the government. Just watch it. The government, Labour said they will still go on a one-day warning strike. So if government say has suspended the subsidy, what are you still warning? So they say they want, so the government will know they are ready to counter with government. The next thing you will hear is that Nigerian Medical Association will come back and say, you remember what we agreed with you have not met it. What do you call it? The academic staff union will come back to government and say, remember what we agreed, you've not made it.
This is such a great conversation we're having. I wish we could continue for longer, but we have run out of time. Thank you so much for coming on the program this afternoon, Mr. Johnson Chukwu.
My pleasure.